actually it does, it would seem to fit the bill here. And what we have been looking at in this study is the way that not one right, and actually, although we talk about transparency, we are also talking about some other rights like freedom of expression and the right to information, which are very important complementary rights to privacy. In fact, in some of our previous work, we had come up with the notion of lex personalitatis, a law of personality. And this is one of the things which hopefully in future studies of privacy and transparency will look at in greater detail. The Germans have been amongst the jurisdictions which have studied this most, which have developed the concept most. And unfortunately, we haven't really had a structured international discussion about the subject. And I'm hoping that this report, which UNESCO has commissioned us to produce, will be part of the fuel which will fuel interest in the study of these three rights together. To a certain extent, they can be called a tripod of rights. In terms of constitutional law, some people may want to call these enabling privacy, freedom of expression, the right to information, could to a certain extent just be determined enabling rights. They are rights, fundamental rights certainly, but which enable the achievement of a higher right. And the higher right is the unhindered right to the development of one's personality. And that is something which I think will benefit from much greater discussion during the next months and years. I don't have much to tell you about the world we live in, so that was my cue here just to think about all the various things which have happened over the past 10 years, including the extent to which so much personal data is now generated in every single transaction we make on the internet, on using our mobile phones, even when not on the internet, using our credit cards. That's the world we live in. And we have to see the extent to which that world is going to get any better or worse. And then you have to define better or worse. But one of the things that we're looking at in the study is, what does privacy mean? Okay, so as you know, one of the greatest problems with privacy for a long time has been defining privacy. And needless to say, we have been examining the traditional versus the modern understandings. Also, needless to say, we leave from a position where we don't consider privacy to be an absolute right, but then many other rights are not absolute rights. And we try to determine the level to which privacy is dead in the digital age, right? Because people keep telling us that privacy is dead. And then we go out and carry out a whole bunch of research, and privacy seems to be even more alive than the last time we checked it. So what we've done in the study is we're looking at privacy at the individual level, we're looking at the corporate level, and we're looking at the state level, we're looking at international level. We've tried to look at the way that measures can be taken up from the highest level to the lowest level. The next thing we did was we looked at freedom of expression. And in freedom of expression, we considered the extent to which freedom of expression has been enlarged by the internet. Today, you no longer need the medium of a journalist or an editor in order to be able to publish worldwide. Some people say it's a good thing, some people say it's a bad thing, and of course we can have a long discussion about that. But it's also endangered in the internet age because, whether we like it or not, there are a number of countries where you are free to say what you like. But unfortunately, if you do say what you like, you have no guarantee that either some form of state service will not pick you up at night and do rather negative things to you. And by the same token, you can say what you like, but the consequences are generally always there. In some countries, more than others, you are in a far better position. And one of the things that we're looking at are the new regulatory approaches which are needed. We also are examining transparency and freedom of information in different contexts, right? So we are also looking at the challenges in the internet age that we are seeing in these two rights. And you will have noticed also the degree of intersection between the rights. I mean, one of the happy things that happened to me when I was appointed Special Rapporteur on Privacy in July of this year was that the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, had actually written a very useful report 2 months before, which was mostly about privacy, which was mostly about anonymity and encryption. And a very useful report it was too, and we have many intersections of the two rights. I generally look at it as the flow of information in society and the way that we regulate those flows of information in society. Professor Rodota, whose works have long been an inspiration to me, was writing about the subject, between 1979 and 1982, when I was still an undergraduate student. And when you look at if I had to refer to an Italian philosopher, Norberto Bobbio, and La democrazia e il potere invisibile, right? Where democracy and the invisible power, where Bobbio was examining the flows of information in society and the resultant impact on the distribution of power in society. But now we're no longer only interested in distribution of power. We're also interested in distribution of money, because so much has been monetized, and we're also interested in all the other impacts that we have. And one of the things that we'd like to bring to the fore is the growing value, we hope, of the personality of the private individual, and how that personality can be both developed by using the internet, and the internet offers a hugely valuable tool for developing one's personality, but also how it can be challenged and damaged. Okay, freedom of expression. I've already talked about some of this, and I don't wish to go out of time. What we've looked at in some of the parts of the study that we are finalizing at this moment in time, we've looked at Google Spain case. We've looked at public figures and freedom of expression. We have looked at anti-terrorism legislation, privacy protection, and we've come out with a few recommendations, which are rather sketchy at this moment in time, but they are directed at least 3 different target audiences. When it comes to national state authorities, we are encouraging self-regulation and co-regulation of the private sector. No great surprises there. We're also recommending an update of the existing legal protection framework, both in scoping the rights, but also providing for exemptions and derogations. We're also recommending greater standardization. We're talking about the improvement of transparency in all stages. We are looking at safeguards for the use of personal data by secret and surveillance services. You could also have security services there. We are openly encouraging the use of encryption, PET, privacy enhancing technologies, and privacy by design, PBD, that's what it is. And I'm sorry it's come out badly here, but also stopping indirect support for countries abusing technologies. So what does that mean in plain English? If you have countries which are seen to be abusing surveillance technologies, we should stop direct or indirect support for this. We could have a whole argument in this room just about that and what we've discovered in the hacking team revelations of July. Insofar as the second target audience, looking at the private sector, once again, we're advocating more transparency. We are advocating a closer look at internal policies and structures. We're talking about the clarification and indeed the simplification of privacy policies. We're talking about transparency reports and their value. a huge value in transparency reports. We're talking about the importance of human rights impact assessments. We're also talking about following higher industrial standards and self-regulation and co-regulation. Um, and by higher industrial standards, there's also talking about building in privacy by design from an industrial point of view. We're talking about the respecting of human rights of all people and adopting policies to the requirements of local laws. Then we have a third target audience, which is international society, which is us and many people out there, and there are recommendations focus on emphasizing the importance of the rights that we're talking about, negotiating and developing new agreements, international agreements, and developing new international agreements, as well as continuing to improve existing international agreements. We are also recommending the minimization of surveillance across borders. And once again, that's another subject which we could be here all week about. One thing which is very important and which builds upon previous work by UNESCO is improving digital literacy and reducing the digital divide. And when looking at life skills, would like to see the extent to which children are also brought up in an atmosphere of sensitivity to awareness of privacy, freedom of expression, etc. Also looking at the economic input and which these human rights have, and the importance of promoting democracy and digital transparency. And that's it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I can come back with more details if questions are asked, but I trust I'm within the 10 minutes.
A little bit more. Thank you so much, Joe. It's such inspiring research. Although we are still finalizing it together with the professor, this meeting workshop will well contribute to this process. So all the comments discussed here are still possible be taken consideration into the final draft. I should also mention that actually this study contributes to UNESCO comprehensive internet study. We are looking at 4 areas: access, free expression, privacy, and ethical dimension. And once it's finalized, we'll make a new edition on the Internet of Freedom series, which we have showcased outside the room. All these books are available online. You can download from the link we have put on the leaflet. And now I think that you have seen we have a very strong panel here. I should not waste more time on moderation, but go straight to the quick comments from our experts. We have experts from different regions, from different stakeholders, and from different age group. We also have the very young activist speaker, Iyad from Syria. So first, I'd like to give floor to our Brazilian expert. It's Mr. Danilo Donida. He is an advisor to the Consumer Office of the Ministry of Justice of Brazil. So you have the floor. I wish you can finish your comments in 3 minutes. So you are the first one.
Let's try. Thank you. If began just that I completely support the position of Professor Kanatashi in the sense that complementation and not balance between freedom of information and privacy is necessary to do. I remember that a French professor, Pierre Catala, some decades ago, planned a theory of information which included freedom of information, privacy, intellectual rights, and data, which all are tried together in a kind of general framework for information society. And that's the way I believe the subject must be approached. We must believe that tools of freedom of information can be used to protect personal data, just as the right to access data, as well as tools of transparency are very important, are fundamental to the protection of personal data, in the sense, for instance, that all treatment of personal data must be public, must be transparent. So the intersection between these two rights is kind of obvious, but of course there will be some problems that must be taken care of by the any national framework. We must believe that without a joint effort, without complementation, we risk having no trust from the society on sharing their data for important, for legitimate purposes. And without sharing data that can be shared, we could have no real use. The data can be useless sometimes. And also there is a particular situation we sometimes feel in Brazil that there is a risk when one side is taken with some preeminence among the other. Just like in Brazil, we have a law on freedom of information and we have no law on personal data. Regardless that we have to improve our freedom of information practices, it's clear to us that sometimes there is a kind of prejudice against the right to privacy, which can be seen, for instance, I will only mention two brief examples. The banalizations of images of CCTVs in public arena, for instance, newspapers and TV used to show images that must be treated secretly by enforcement agencies. But for a Brazilian common sense, they kind of belong to the public. And also we can notice an overflow of personal info in some journalistic pieces of information. That all creates a kind of risk of retrocess in regulation. We must remember that we are approaching the regulation of a general framework on data protection in Brazil. In the drafting of this proposal, the Ministry of Justice tried to implement some protections to freedom of information, just like the law on personal data doesn't apply to personal data used for journalistic purposes, but also for literary, artistic, and academic purposes. But what can be done of this, it depends on the Congress and then of the judges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I noticed you are setting a clock here to remind you. Such a good practice of self-regulation. Yes. Oh yeah, you can say.
That's my best
so
effort.
how we balance this, we can ask our maybe young speaker, and really appreciate particularly the good practice from Brazil. We know that Brazil is really leading this internet governance and also the balancing rights. So it's very useful to our research. So now I wonder if we already got the slide for our young speaker Yad ready. Yes, it's there.
I just need the remote control. If
yes, okay.
you have it.
And Mr. Iyad Kalas, he is a co-founder of Radio Surreali in Syria.
Exactly.
And thank you so much for traveling to here and share. At the internet age, we all need to learn from the youth. And thank you to be here. And now, floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming. My name is Iyad Kalas. I come from Syria. Radio Surreali is a community development, Syrian community development radio and advocacy radio. We work in conflict zone, so probably this is the way I'm gonna tackle the transparency and privacy issues that we face every day since we're reporting from conflict zones. For us, when we talk about transparency and privacy, they're very strongly associated with accountability. Transparency is very strongly associated with accountability because we're reporting on crimes of war, we're reporting on a lot of issues happening every day. There's a lot of data coming from Syria, and seeing the internet, everybody has turned either into a fighter or into a citizen journalist, so we're getting a lot of data. So we try to deal with it as a media outlet, as a responsible media outlet. We try to take it with we try to be as much socially responsible as possible, but it's getting complicated every day because when we increase transparency to a point that might tackle the privacy of individuals or groups and might affect their security, their personal security. I mean, probably a report on the internet might get somebody's head off. It's that bad. So we try to be as much as responsible as possible. And for that, we try to work a lot on what would lead to peace building and the school that we call positive media. Ethics are very important. Transparency and privacy as ethics of conduct, as an ethical conduct of journalism, are very important. But so are the dignity of the people, and so are the usefulness, the public interest that we try to deliver by working in such a conflict zone. So we try, in order to be socially responsible, we try to work on 3 levels. We have a methodology that we try to develop to work with the people with the reporting. First of all, we differentiate. We differentiate between the groups and the individuals, because reporting on individuals is not as important as reporting on the groups. The groups are mostly responsible for the acts and not the individuals. The individuals are mostly radicalized by groups or brainwashed by groups. So this is how we try to focus on groups more than anybody else. We try to differentiate between what's happening online and offline. We know that there's a strong connection, so we try to create the environment not to create any kind of a violation of privacy and security offline. Number 2, we try to cooperate. By cooperating, we care a lot about public interest. And I mean by that we protect our sources. We provide them with secure channels so they could communicate with us without violating their privacy on the internet, while keeping a level of transparency of what's happening on the floor. For our reporters, we give them the right training, we give them VPN, we give them everything they need so they wouldn't bust themselves and be exposed themselves on the internet. Because once you're exposed on the internet, you're not safe on the ground, even if you're in the exile. And this happened to our colleagues in Turkey, for example. And we also try to work with the civil society, with civil society organizations, and we try to benefit from researches done by the UNESCO, for instance, by Human Rights Watch and whatsoever. And number 3, we try to educate. We know that we're a bit far away from what's going to happen in the future when we talk about digital citizenship and e-rights. We're a bit far away from that. We should be really careful about the privacy, but we try to, since we're a media outlet, we try to benefit from that, and we try to educate people about the digital citizenship and what's related to it. So maybe one day in the future we could benefit from that. If you have any questions, you could reach me by email or here by questions, and I'm available during the 3 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Iyad. It's a really new aspect, which I don't think we have addressed in your study about the transparency and privacy in conflict region, which will definitely be considered later on. So now I move forward to our company representative, Mr. Pedro Les Andrade. He's the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Latin America of Google. Also our old friend of UNESCO. Thank you for coming. Please, floor is yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to focus on what are the challenges that we are seeing from the private sector, and particularly with focus in Latin America. And well, I have been witnessing this, have been working on data protection and privacy for the past 18 years, so I can see the evolution. But also I can see some lack of evolution in terms of what we need to do to get, the next level of legislation and regulation in terms of privacy. One of the key issues that we are seeing is that sometimes we are facing with definitions in the different privacy legislations that are outdated for the information society. And this could lead us to confuse personal data with information. Sometimes we see very broad definition of what is considered personal data, and that can lead to this confusion. And this is something that we discussed in our past workshop last year. That was one of the key issues around the discussion on right to be forgotten, that sometimes, it's a problem that some information get caught in that discussion that is not personal data, it's information that needs to be there. So that is key to, because, if you're in the, we can risk to be, instead of on the information society, on the personal data society, if we don't focus more on new definitions on what we consider personal data. Also, another challenge that we see here has to do with the issues of jurisdiction, and also going back to the example of right to be forgotten. For example, what happened with France when CNIL asked Google to apply the concept of right to be forgotten worldwide. And we showed that we were unable to do that. And in fact, we have a good example in Latin America. We have the Supreme Court of Colombia that came out with a complete different interpretation of what rights to be forgotten should be implemented. And as completely opposite of of the interpretation. And there were, two Supreme Courts, supreme bodies of the judiciary that has completely different opinions. That's also another important point to keep in mind. Particularly for regions like Latin America, that we have, the benefits to speak almost one or two languages with Brazil and Spanish-speaking Latin America. What we are seeing is a lot of different legislation on privacy with different principles that makes very difficult for a company in Latin America to work across the region. So harmonization is something important also. It's very interesting the work that the Organization of American States is doing on this regard. They're setting up model principles on data protections with the aim to start to just get more harmonized on this. And it's a really good work in progress that I think that is very looking forward in terms of privacy. So I think that I'm all of my time now, yes? So those are mainly So those are mainly the points. Also, what we are seeing, we just released our new report on a transparency report where you can see how many requests from governments we receive. But in the H1 2014 report, what we have been seeing, for example, for Latin America, is that the defamation request from the government, this could come from the judiciary or from government bodies. In Latin America, 50% is almost about defamation, which in other regions accounts for 1/3. And this is something that interesting, that sometimes what we see is that people that want to solve issues around defamation are using data protection as a shortcut. Because sometimes it's so hard to get a good decision depending on the different laws of defamation in different countries, that they might find a shortcut using privacy. That could lead to a lot of problems on free expression and access to information.
Thank you. Thank you. Very useful inputs. Actually, it reminds me our UNESCO previous publication on the intermediaries' role in fostering freedom of expression. We also echoes your recommendation to have more enabling legislation for the companies to be responsible for human rights. And but still, there are so many issues here. For example, but even within the company, I mean the terms of services, and you have your self-regulatory framework, which could also be very much contribute to the issue as well. We can discuss later. And now I have to move to our next speaker. It's Mr. Danny O'Brien. Did I pronounce it well? I just learned it from him. And he's a co-founder of Open Rights Group and also the international director of one of the leading NGO in the area. It's called the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, based in San Francisco, US. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I think the framework that Joe described, that the report embodies, of these interlocking domains, is incredibly useful. And I think part of the reason why it's so useful is as participants on the internet and new technology, and I think the background that I'm going to be speaking from is largely about representing the individual rights of users and participants in technology and the information society, is that those domains are very blurred. We quickly move from one domain to another, or depending on the rights and responsibilities of each of those domains. And each of us, I think, now have a set of well, they're no longer professions. I think they're no longer even roles. I think they're capabilities of each individual. Each of us can be at any point in our lives a citizen journalist, whether it's something that we choose to take up as something that's important for us, or have it put upon us. I know people who have been involved in the Syrian conflict who had no interest in politics or documenting what they saw around them, but quickly found themselves in a vital and important capacity. So often these are powers of freedom of expression that we can now take because of the technology we have. We're also, I think, all, perhaps not by the letter of the law, but certainly, as I say, in terms of our capacity, I think we're also all data controllers and we're all data processors. I think one of the fascinating things and one of the things that made the data protection principles so prescient was that they described a world in which everybody had this capacity to collect and process and share and use data. And I think that's important to note because it's not just large companies who take advantage of these capabilities, and it's not something that we should reserve solely to those companies. We're also all public figures. We're also public figures and private figures. Some of the most fascinating aspects, I think, to that reinforcement between privacy and transparency that I've seen is when individuals, just to give an example, on Twitter, go from being just people talking to their friends to finding that something's been retweeted, they suddenly have thousands of followers, they have a lot of public attention, and the attitude to their private data suddenly shifts to becoming a public figure without them having any of the protections of a traditional public figure. You go from a situation where somebody's private information is sacrosanct to a position where people feel they have a public duty to trail through someone's past. And finally, we're all citizens, we're all participants in the open information society. And I think that's a really important one, because when we think of freedom of information, we think most importantly about powerful institutions and obtaining information from them. And of course, what do those powerful institutions contain? An incredible amount of personal data about citizens. And we don't want to be in a situation where freedom of information dissuades people from participating and getting involved in the process. I am running over a little bit, so I'll just quickly summarize how quickly these things can shift and how important it is to have in a regulatory environment very fixed lines so people know when they're going to cross them. But in this period of transition, I think it's important to allow us the flexibility to shift between them. There was a time when your vote was something of a public record. People didn't see a responsibility to keep a vote private. There was a time when your address, which I remember in living memory with telephone directories, made perfect sense to publish an address. If you published an address or found the address of someone these days, it would be doxing. It would make somebody very vulnerable. And I think that things are shifting so quickly, we have to make sure that everybody who's in charge of regulating this environment is aware of all of these interlocking domains. Because if you're a data protection authority, you're also responsible for freedom of expression on the internet. And if you're a regulator who's charged with protecting freedom of expression on the internet or freedom of information, you're also in charge of data protection.
Thank you so much. You cited how complicated the issue involving, because involving so many actors, so many different frameworks. We do need a sort of harmony there. And now I want to apologize for our last speaker, because when I organizing a panel, my habits go for mathematics in the gender equality, which I have 3 female speakers and 3 male speakers in my habit. But this time, somehow that I failed. So I think that Caroline, you can have maybe speak 1 more minute. And so, okay, let me introduce you formally. Miss Carolina Rossini. She is the Vice President of Internet Policy and Public Knowledge. And we may also introduce a bit further because it's too brief. Okay, now floor is yours. Can speak more minutes.
Hi, is working? Okay. I'm actually from Brazil, but I work in the US now, and I work on this environment for more than 15 years, passing through every stakeholder, from companies to academia to civil society. What did you do here?
Same as it did.
Okay, you control, yeah. And so first, I would like to thank you. I will try to keep to 3 minutes, but thank you for the 4th minute. First, I want to thank you to all the work here you guys did at this table. I know some of you for many years, and without you, I think we would be really worst if the NSA surveillance revelations were not worst enough. But second, I think we need to also look at other things that are happening, because while I agree very much with the principles and recommendations you are doing and we're working on, and I'm very happy you got elected for this position, a lot of people are not paying attention where actually hard law is being negotiated and implemented. So I'm talking about trade agreements. I'm talking about something that a lot of countries do, which is forum shifting. They cannot get the most pressing laws at the national environment, for example, for any political reasons, and then they go outside their country, where sometimes they have more negotiation power. They go to negotiate with developing countries, and then because developing countries need access to the commodity markets, developing countries give a lot of other rights that we worry about: freedom of expression, access to knowledge, access to textbooks, and in a lot of cases, privacy. So one of the works I've been doing, I've been to most of the rounds of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was just signed some time ago, and actually now the countries have 90 days to move it towards the national environment. This is one of the agreements that have a lot of substantive law, which means that it can, in general, be directly applied at the federal law. They become a federal law in those countries: Vietnam, Brunei, and a lot of South Asia countries, in Latin America, Peru, Chile, and Mexico. And on those trade agreements, if you look at chapters such as e-commerce, service, and telco, there is where they are regulating our privacy without us paying attention to. I think to work at the UN level is extremely important. That's where we get the documents to exercise accountability when we go back to our countries. But trade agreements are non-transparent, closed venues, multilateral venues. And even with the USTR, which is the negotiating head, or all the negotiating heads forming transparency commitments in the Open Government Partnership, those transparency commitments are not enough, because you actually don't know. Just now, we know what's there about privacy. And for the first time in a trade agreement, we actually have national security and surveillance issues written down in a trade agreement. So trade agreements have broadened the scope much more from the very old traditional trade barriers. Talking about trade barriers, how am I in my time? Okay. Safe harbor. You guys have probably heard that the safe harbor was considered, how do you say that in English? Well, they dropped the safe harbor. The European Union invalidated this safe harbor. And there were 2-3 hearings in the US Congress. I'm based in Washington now. So there were 2-3 hearings last week where a lot of American companies are actually pushing the US government to sue the European Union at the WTO, World Trade Organization, through the dispute settlement mechanism. So privacy is being seen as a trade barrier, as it is exceptions and limitations on copyright that help all of us have access to education and so many things. So I would encourage all of us, and I'm available, and there are incredible people here from Latin America working on trade, to talk more about that if we need. So I think my final note is on balancing all of that. I liked a lot what the Google representative mentioned here, that we need to separate personal data from information. I am a believer in open science, collaborative science, and a lot of things that are happening in science are possible because we share data. Patients want to share data because they want to find their cure for Alzheimer's, for cancer, and for many other issues. There is a great project on informed consent that solves a lot of privacy issues. However, if countries do put high barriers to cross-border data flows, we won't be able to match data from China, from Europe, with US and Latin America. So we need to somehow, and I don't have the answer for that, figure out exceptions that are important for issues like, for example, health, clinical trials, understanding the effect of medicines, understanding has a disease progress. So I think it's a very hard issue. It's not a black and white question. So we have to consider this, I think, in a holistic manner to really understand what works, what not work. And don't forget to pay attention to the hard law core places where law is actually made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think our last woman speaker didn't disappoint us, really gave us so much new ideas. We do agree with you because UNESCO has been promoting open access to scientific information. When we talk about transparency, it's really not only talking about the government. Since I'm reminded by that clock. We only have 10 minutes. I can't believe it. Since we started late, can I take liberty? We can have 10 more minutes, and so we have 20 minutes for discussion. And Jill, do you like to give some quick feedback, or you like to go straight to the audiences?
No, I think it's fair that we go to the audience and see what they have to say. But perhaps in picking up any responses, I wouldn't mind going first because I have to go and speak somewhere else in 10 minutes' time. So, so if we have a midway, and I'll be glad to respond briefly. Thank you.
Okay. Also, thank you. Thank everybody here. I see so many people are sitting on the floor, and somebody standing from the behind. It shows such a strong interest in this important subject. So now I open the floor. I promote the culture of Twitter. Can you limit your intervention, question, or comment into 140 words in 10 seconds, s'il vous plaît? Okay, please, the lady here, I think you just noted me, right? Okay, yeah, you have the floor.
Thanks. I'm Giovanna Domenico. I have a question for you, and my question is about if I have understood very well that in your opinion self-regulation and co-regulation could be suited sources to regulate privacy and freedom of speech. Any doubt in name of democracy and representative if our fundamental rights are regulated by private people? That's all.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'd like to collect maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then we go. Okay, the gentleman there, please.
Andrei Sherbovic, Moscow Higher School of Economics. Could you please tell which international standards in sphere of protection of privacy you could provide and how they could be formulated? Thank you.
Who else? Yes, please.
Patrick Curry, EU Project Mapping. Privacy is about the release of information or not between 2 or more parties, which means access control. Access control requires some form of authentication and identity management to support the trust relationship. So my question is, how do you see authentication and identity management helping to assist improvements in authentication, helping to improve privacy?
Thank you for a good question. And anybody from behind? Yeah, I saw a lady. Thank you. As a remote participation? No, okay, please.
It's there on the top, you see?
Oh, yes, okay.
We have this question from Bush from India.
Shall I read it? Okay. She said,
You want me to read? I can read.
I can read it, thank you. I would like to ask the gentleman from Google, that's Pedro, if he thinks that government intervention with regard to privacy should operate on the principle that the internet and the digital users are unaware of the repercussion of breach of their privacy by private companies like Google, and consequently individuals consent should not be the ultimate exception to the protection of a certain kind of data or information. So, if there are no other quick... oh yeah, I'd like to give the floor to the gentleman sitting on the floor to my left. Yes, yes, please, floor is yours. Another guy over there. Okay, then we start to respond. Let me know if
My question relates to citizen journalists who are operating in repressive environments. Like in my own country, Zimbabwe, there was an anonymous and pseudonymous guy who just cropped up on Facebook, and he had a large following. But what he was saying, although it was true, but he was not accountable because he was using an encryption. So how do you balance maybe the right of citizen journalists to remain anonymous or maybe private, but at the same time, how do you know whether what they are saying, how do they become accountable? So how do you balance, those interlocking, domains?
Thank you. Thank you for this very valid question.
And also, I think Google, because I know that our government ended up, coming to you to produce a transparency report for you to identify who that person was. So I wanted to seek, clarification. Under what circumstances do you disclose the identity of that person to a repressive government? Thank you.
Okay, that's a hard one. So we go for the last question from a gentleman to my right side. Please give the floor, yeah, and then I will give the priority to Joe to respond, and then I will go through our panelists.
Thank you. My name is Tagabu from Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. So my question is for you. With many constraints like related to encryption, related to security, for example, in the one who the gentleman presented the case of Syria, would you believe that there will be a balance between privacy and transparency with at equal level in some time, because there are a lot of constraints?
Thank you. I think we really have got more than enough questions, and also we have so little time now. I give priority to Joe. Could you just give some feedback very quickly? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with the right question, with the last question. First of all, I think that before you talk about transparency and privacy, you should also talk about security. And I'm also one of those people who doesn't like to talk about balancing privacy and security. I think that security and privacy and transparency complement each other. It's just how you organize things in such a way that you do it in a way which is appropriate in a democratic society. So that's my first point, that when you talk about transparency and privacy, include security and see not how you're going to balance them, but it's a bit like cooking and the recipe. I don't know whether you like your food, but I enjoy mine. And you don't need to have exactly the right amount of herbs or paprika in a recipe to make a good dish, but you have to have just the right amount. And sometimes you add more and sometimes you add less. And it depends on what you're trying to do, right? And the same applies to security, the same applies to privacy, the same applies to transparency. A number of important points have been raised, and I've tried to take some notes. But the point that has been raised about repressive societies, that's a particularly difficult issue, as Dr. Xiaohong Hu said. I would suggest that we have to err on the rights of the safety and security of individuals, which is why, as far as I'm concerned, anonymity is a sacred right if you need to take things forward in a society. There are many societies, unfortunately, where there is some form of repression or another which is carried out using the internet, using information which is revealed on the internet, and that is dangerous. So when it comes to identifying somebody who has hidden behind anonymity, you have to think about mechanisms there which are properly thought out in a rule of law context. You can't simply give that away. I mean, I could go on at length over there because you need a number of appropriate safeguards in order to make sure that you go behind the technical safeguards which have been set up to protect somebody's anonymity. So this is a bit similar to the discussion that we have going on forever and ever about Tor, right? When you understand that Tor is subsidized to a certain extent by the United States, 70, 80, 90%, when you see how much funding is spent so that people around the world can have a means to access information in a private manner, and in a manner which does not expose them to retribution. And then on the other side, you have the police and you have secret services who are constantly complaining about Tor because it makes life difficult. Now, and it's the same police in the United States who also do that. Not only them, police around the world complain about Tor. But I think it's very important that we realize that in the end, you often go down on the side of the person who is weakest or most exposed. The lady asked a question about self-regulation and co-regulation. Well, I think within my team and myself personally, we published some work even about self-regulation on the internet and other places. Self-regulation and co-regulation should be encouraged, and they're fine and dandy. But we must also realize that there are places where co-regulation and self-regulation just does not work. And at that moment in time, we've got to be responsible enough and sensible enough and say, I'm sorry, we're trying to give you we're trying to give self-regulation and co-regulation a chance. It's not working. Here comes regulation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. And my colleague Rachel is actually taking notes. We will definitely provide to you and consider all the questions and comments. Look, I have difficult to balance the questions and responses because we only have a few minutes. So now I'm giving 1 minute to each of our panelists to give your responses or your last comment to our audiences. So who would like to take the first floor? Maybe from you? Yes, our Google gentleman, please.
So, well, to address the first question that addressed to me, I'm going to build on top of what Professor Kanatachi just mentioned about the importance of consider privacy, transparency, and security all together. And I will add also control, and control by the user. The ability of the user that consent could be not enough. And so, no, it's okay. Consent could be not enough, and sometimes the user needs to have tools within the platforms to control his information, to see what they want to show, to understand what information is gathered from him. And that way is a way to exercise its right to information determination. This is very important in order to also complement what consent could do. The fact, going to the second question that has to do with requirements from repressive countries to release information. What we do is, first, there are countries where we are not operating because we consider that by operating in those countries that put our users at risk, and we have decided to take very tough decisions, sometimes relinquish very big markets, and not to have operations in certain markets because of that. So that is part of our commitment to our users. In other countries that could be, we always look at the rule of law. We always look at due process. We always have lawyers analyzing the requests and analyzing if those requests are in line with the local law, and if there is the ability of users to defend themselves before those against those requests. So those are kind of the analysis that we do when we have to release information.
Thank you. I just noticed maybe there's another event which will start immediately. I'm sorry, so we are just finishing in 3 minutes, okay? I promise. Then my panelists, everybody gives a tweet to respond to either question or last comment. Thank you. Sorry for my...
Just my general take on this, whether in a progressive country, in a conflict zone, or in a developed world, transparency, and this is my personal take, accountability and transparency should be applied more on the powerful, and privacy and security should be given more to the powerless.
Carolina.
Let me try this one. That was very good. Thank you for that. I think, again, it's a complex issue we need to get involved in. We need to speak with other, how I call them, sister communities, to see what is at the table in terms of when it's good, when it's bad, sharing information and personal data. And I think we need to also try to start speaking more seriously with the intelligence community to see when actually things are necessary and what is necessary, and if they are collecting information, how much actually is necessary and how that actually works or not. Yeah, so I'm talking about necessary and proportionate, but I'm also talking about prove us, show us that collecting information actually helps to prevent things. So I think that's really important engagement we should be thinking of.
So briefly, just to check into the comments from Carolina Rossini about the safe harbor agreement, which was written invalid, I want to stress that when taking data protection as a commercial issue, we tend to forget that some courts, such as the European Court of Justice, are pushed on the opposite side, on the direction that that protection is a fundamental right. It can be a clash of standards that if it really provokes a difficulty to complement privacy and data protection, it will have causalities in the freedom of information side, but also in the data protection side.
And just very quickly to touch on some of the questions that talked about anonymity, I think particularly in societies where there are challenges about discussion and free discussion, I think protecting anonymity is incredibly important. I think that while I understand the point that part of being able to protect the propagation of private information requires some kind of authentication, I don't necessarily think that authentication has to be tied to identity strongly. And I also think one of the reasons why we need to push hard to protect people's individual right to encryption and anonymity so that they're the only people who know who they are rather than necessarily sharing information with intermediaries is because when we look at repressive societies, I'm increasingly seeing technologists and users of that technology being targeted and that being used as an excuse to chill and imprison them for otherwise perfectly reasonable acts of freedom of expression. We see this in Ethiopia, we see this in Syria, and I don't want to see that spread to any further.
Thank you so much. My last tweet is really to thank all our panelists and our participants and all the girls and boys helping us with this logistics. And I invite you to UNESCO sessions on Thursday and Friday. We will continue this discussion. We will address more questions that you have raised. Please take a leaflet. We have all the publication information about UNESCO and also panelists there. So I wish to catch up in our other session and other occasion. Thank you. Can you take a picture of a panel of us?
Let's clear this away.
Yeah,
we can shift. Oh, yeah, sure. Well,
não, fecha.
Last picture. Thank you.